The paper is Being, Thinking, Creating. When war attacks the setting and the transference counterattacks. I think that you have the German translation. In my various encounters with psychoanalysts from other countries, I have always been fascinated by their capacity to make plans for the future. Whenever a colleague suggested that I take part in some project or other, he or she would usually be surprised to hear me reply, "We will see. We'll have to get back to each other on that." My answer was looked upon as an equivocation, since at the start of our discussion, I had been passionately enthusiastic. I then realized that projecting in the future meant something quite different to each of us. For my colleague, time was consistent and governed by the rhythm of predictability, while I was locked into the unpredictability of a space-time dimension at the mercy of some unexpected traumatic event. War. War may be declared at any time and may indeed be continuous, as I have known it to be for 15 and a half years. It is as though war were an ordinary phenomenon, as though we were living in a constant state of stroma on borrowed time of indefinite duration. In this paper, I shall not discuss the clinical aspects of trauma as such, nor those of temporality. I shall explore how a psychoanalyst can go on working in a context in which the unforeseen reigns. Unexpected events in the outside world often make the analyst's task difficult or even incompatible with the invariants that make psychoanalytic treatment possible. What becomes of the analytical setting when it is subjected to unpredictability? How can the unchanging nature of the setting be protected when it is constantly under attack? What happens when both analyst and analysand are caught up in the same traumatic situation? To update this text, I have added this paragraph. I can believe that we can apply this questioning to all unpredictable situations when they attack the setting and when both analysts and analysand are caught up in the same traumatic situation. I think about what we have lived in the COVID-19 pandemic, or what our Ukrainian colleagues are living now in war conditions. This is why this text, published in 2011, concerning the attack of the psychoanalytical setting in war conditions, has revealed the interest of many psychoanalysts during the COVID-19 pandemic, which attacks also the setting. In October 2020, the manager of the IPA site asked me to make it a podcast in English, French, and Italian. The questioning, trying to find a solution in a situation of war where the psychoanalysts and their patients are facing the same trauma against the unpredictable, which attacks the invariance of the setting, seems to be a similar problematic in these two traumatic states: war, the pandemic, and even maybe to many others. Perhaps this can explain why I have lectured this text many times in many countries, and why it has been translated in 9 different languages. In Lebanon, we have lived through some extreme situation that even today cannot be properly processed because we are still living in a traumatogenic environment. Any attempt at drawing up an inventory of all the specific instances of attacks against the setting in a war situation would be completely unrealistic. Nonetheless, it is possible and feasible to base such a study on situations that have been experienced in actual reality. Emile, Paul, and Nadine are 3 patients with whom I experienced out of the ordinary situations brought about by war, situations to which some response had to be made, and at once, in the immediacy of a reality that could not wait. Emile. Sitting in my psychoanalyst armchair, I can hear the bombs pounding in the distance. Emile is talking to me about his father, his mother, his fantasy world. The noise of the bombs is coming closer. Like all my compatriots, I recognize the 3 successive phases of the noise that the bomb makes. First phase, the noise when they are fired, also known as départ, that gradually approaches. The second phase, the whistling sound they make as they pass nearby, and the third phase, the echo of their disintegration when they hit their target, also known as arrivée, as they explode closer and closer. I feel afraid for Emile, for myself, for my family. I'm thinking about some of my relatives who are probably driving along some road or other. I'm afraid for them. Emile is talking to me about his fantasy world. I hear shells explode, their fragments striking the walls of the building just next door, and an indication that the bombs are falling closer and closer. I'll have to make a phone call just to be sure that my family are safe, forgetting that even phones were not functioning at that time. Emile is talking to me about his fantasy world. I hear people shouting in the entrance hall of my building. I hear footsteps as my neighbors rush headlong down the staircase towards the shelter. Perhaps we should go there too. I hear Emile saying, nothing can happen to me because you're here with me. And he tells me about his fantasy world. I'm not listening to him anymore. Farewell, evenly suspended attention, benevolent neutrality, active matrix, transformation process. Henceforth, nothing is of any importance to me other than reality and my responsibility. What should I do with Emile? Send him out into the street? That would be my way of ignoring external reality and experiencing this folie à deux, which is no longer mine, with henceforth is only a one-person folie, hallucinating the presence of another person who is no longer present. Emile is talking to me about his fantasy world. I was no longer present. I had been caught up in my perception of reality, a traumatic reality, the one that Emile was at that very point denying. He was caught up in his internal representations that split him off from perceiving that external reality. He was carried away by his idealizing transference onto an omnipotent analyst, the protecting and containing mother, keeping him safe, that I was for him in the continuity of his own world, even though I was no longer able to sustain that role. He was caught up in a transference neurosis that was dominated by a few delusional aspects, the least of which was the almost psychotic refusal to integrate any reality element, as Michel Nero would have said. He was carried away by a kind of hallucination brought about by regression. Fortunately, this was quickly halted as soon as he faced up to the reality testing that took place once the session was over. But not before that point. We had to wait 45 minutes, 45 long minutes, until Émile's ego came out of the hallucinatory world of dreams and fantasy, and at last managed to differentiate between hallucinating and perceiving once external reality came to the fore with all of its sensoriality. He was then able to hear the bombs. He heard them, but he was not afraid because, as he kept on saying, I was present and protecting him. Although there was no longer any denial of reality, the end of the session brought him face to face with all the sensorial aspects of perceiving an obvious danger. The idealizing transference was still functioning as a screen, as a defensive maneuver set up by his ego, overwhelmed as it was by a kind of reality that was difficult to metabolize. The transference illusion functioned as a protective shield between Emile and a deadly reality. The interrelation was a protective shield against what was overwhelming him on an intra-psychic level. I settled him down in my waiting room, well protected by the internal walls at the very heart of my consulting room. I had to give him some water, sandwiches, a radio set so that he could keep up to date with the news, and later a mattress so that he could spend the night there. These being survival kits, obviously. It was only the following morning that Emile was able to leave. Paul, there has been no sessions for a whole fortnight now. There has been no let up in the bombing for the past 2 weeks, intensive bombing with no interruption. One of the characteristic features of the war in this country was that it was forever changing its identity, it was discontinuous, and it moved from region to region. But now it is continuous. All regions are being targeted. So Paul has not been able to come to his sessions for a whole fortnight, and he was going through a very fragile phase. I'm at home in my dressing gown. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. The doorbell rings. I open the front door. I see Paul standing in the doorway. His complexion is sallow, his face almost white. I cannot stop the look of surprise that comes over me. He says that he absolutely needs to talk to me. I think of the setting, of its constancy, of its unvarying spatial and temporal aspects. But I'm thinking also of the fact that Paul is in distress and that he is suffering. How can one empathize yet empathize, you say? How can one empathize yet still remain a psychoanalyst? Empathy is necessary, but thinking is essential. Thinking as a psychoanalyst, said André Green in the Pensée Clinique. I must listen to what he has to say, but where? The floor of my study has mattresses all over it. Some family members have come over to stay because my house is situated in an area that is less likely to be shelled. They are all here, chatting away. I'm in my dressing gown, my hair not even brushed. I ask Paul to wait a moment or two. Then I'll come back and let him in. I dash into the study, put the mattresses into an adjoining room, get the furniture back in place, put away the photos of my children, tell everybody to be absolutely quiet, get dressed in a hurry, and brush my hair. All that takes me a couple of minutes. I go back out to fetch Paul. He is standing exactly as I left him, as though petrified. I tell him to come in. As soon as he sits down, he starts talking to me. He looks at me as if I were the only thing in the whole world that counted for him. As if nothing has changed. The address, the space, the wall, the time, the entire setting, nothing. External reality no longer existed. Nothing existed except me. Me as an object of catexis of everything that is maternal, paternal, protective. Although there had been some enactment as regards the external, spatial setting, nothing has changed with respect to the external continuity that I could offer him via the extended kind of handling that stretched from my consulting room, 15 kilometers away but unreachable, to my home, the only place that he could reach and into which I could take him. I had the feeling that I was the one who was maintaining the setting. More than that, I felt that I was the setting. The protective matrix was both me and what I was making of the link between us. What I was making of our encounter, a psychoanalytic relationship. What I was making of the interrelation of analytical communication in that encounter between me, the analyst, and him, the analysand, without any confusion between transference catexis and me as a person. Nadine. I had been seeing Nadine and Karim for about a year. It was a couple. Together, or each of them singly. For the past month, both of them together once again. From intense love to extreme hatred, from passionate exaltation to the most hostile feelings, everything was present, just as in every couple. Monday, 11 o'clock. I'm waiting for Nadine and Karim. 11:15, they're late. 11:30, they're not here yet. They're probably not coming. They don't come. They didn't come. In the previous session, they had quite an argument. Nadine had said that she wanted to leave him. I'm thinking, maybe she wanted to leave me too? I feel somewhat worried. Karim can be quite violent. Had he injured her? Wednesday, 10:15. Will they come today? 10:20. They're still not here. 10:25. The doorbell rings. I open the door. I see Nadine, alone, dressed in black, a white veil on her head, in Islam, a sign of mourning. A link immediately comes to my mind. The terrorist bombing that I'd seen on television, the victims torn to shreds, and Nadine and Karim's address that they told me about in a previous session. I look at Nadine. She looks at me searchingly, realizes that I have understood. She takes a few steps forward. I stretch out my hand for our usual handshake. She cries and throws herself into my arms. I think of benevolent neutrality, of the rule of abstinence, of the law of the third party. But I think too of the pain that she is feeling and of her need to be contained in this unexpected halting so as to be sure that I am there for her and that I will be able to offer her the feeling of continuity that she needs so much now that Karim is dead. For a moment or two, she lets herself go in my arms. I contain her without moving. I think of Winnicott. I feel myself to be a structuring support for her. She cries, saying over and over again, I didn't want him to die. I didn't want him to die. They picked up the pieces. She gently moves away, looks at me, and heads toward the chair on which she usually sits. She falls silent for a moment or two, then talks about what happened that day and about the guilt she feels so difficult to bear. In his book on Freud's sayings, Alain de Mijola mentions Freud's reply when Blanton asked him if he had been able to go on working once the Nazis has invaded Austria. Freud answered, no, when consciousness is disrupted, it's impossible to show any interest in the unconscious. That is what happened to me when I was with Emile. I was no longer interested in his unconscious, the first case. I was not listening to him anymore. I was caught up in some external issue that prevented me from listening to him. I was afraid for him, for myself, for my relatives who were out driving somewhere. When trauma is part of the actual reality of both analyst and analysant, how can transformation be brought about? What becomes of the analyst role? No attentive listening, no interpretation, no transformation, just a presence while the session lasts, when suddenly outside war attacks the setting. But by being there, respecting his splitting, the transference neurosis, and the hallucinatory aspects within the session, expressed more powerfully than the external traumatic dimension that might have prevented him from going on with the session, I was able to offer Emile a space that formed a protective shield and to contain within the setting the unfolding of his intrapsychic conflict. It was as though, in spite of everything, I could still cathect his mental functioning thanks to a counter-transference shield between him and the outside world. I am talking here, of course, only of that session when the war burst in upon an already existing setting and a process that was already ongoing. But if war is there from the very beginning and is continuous, would it ever be possible to establish a setting and cathect the psychoanalytic relationship? In my view, that would make nonsense of the analyst as a person, turning him or her into an all-powerful character split off in omnipotence, as if the analyst could be in some kind of control of an unpredictable setting, a mindless Superman figure in a denial of external reality and of his or her own psychic reality. In Paul's case, the setting was no longer the usual one. When the setting becomes inaccessible because of the traumatic impact of war, the transference neurosis appears to restrict it by making its spatial and temporal materiality disappear. This is transposed onto the analyst, who is no longer the guardian of the objective setting, but actually becomes that setting, wherever the analyst happens to be. It is the articulation of the transference-counter-transference relationship that structures the situation. What will the analyst do with the transference neurosis, with this link between him or herself and the analysand, with the encounter that in the case which I'm describing becomes impossible in the initial setting? For Paul, the imminence of that encounter was a real need, according to Winnicott. By understanding Paul's wish to see me as a need, the need to protect himself against being overwhelmed on the level of his psychic economy, by offering him the kind of handling typical of a mother devoted to her infant, and by agreeing not to limit myself to the space and time of a constricted setting, which was anyway inaccessible, I gave precedence to the encounter itself, to the analytical bond, to the psychoanalytic relationship. This subjectivation of that bond indestructible. I did the same thing in my encounter with Nadine, although here the spatial and temporal aspects of the setting had not changed. Through her non-verbal behavior, she was expressing the intense grief of a woman in mourning. I was the only person who could make meaningful the pain and distress that were in her eyes, which carried within them the immense guilt of a death wish that had magically been fulfilled through the instantaneous impact of a terrorist bomb. She threw herself into my arms. What is an analyst to do when a transference enactment is a request for a containment of a war trauma and, in this case, of a guilt feelings that could not be mentalized? What is an analyst to do with his or her countertransference feelings when faced with the sheer horror of a dramatic event for which no representation is possible? Without falling prey to the kind of sentimentalism that would have led both of us into an uncontrollable state of emotion, without taking refuge behind the rule of abstinence in order to protect a setting enclosed in the imperviousness of an inappropriate physical distance between us, I took Nadine into my arms for a moment or two. I agreed to that holding, which was crucial for the equilibrium of her endangered psychic economy. There too, just as with Emile and Paul, it is the articulation between the transference and the countertransference that constructs and structures the situation, while all the time taking care to preserve the psychoanalytic dimension. I agree with André Green and Paul Denis when they argue that this is not simply a question of intersubjectivity. There is an articulation between two specific psychic tendencies and their related processing. Psychoanalytic treatment is not an interaction, it is the analysis of an interaction. This is what I call an interrelation. The analyst's catexis of the analysand's mental functioning, the understanding of the transference neurosis as a transference catexis of what the analyst represents and not the person he is, together act as a protective shield with respect to the danger of being overwhelmed when destructiveness, in the present case war, is everywhere and when unbinding of the drives becomes likely. In wartime, in the cases that I have presented, attacks against the setting represent a work of the negative that remains peripheral. It does not nullify the interrelation, which remains protected and cathected by both analyst and analysand. That interrelation is like an eyelet, an opening for the wish to stay alive when the analyst remains in the role of analyst, while enlarging the setting to the extent of representing it, him or herself. If, however, the analyst does not stay within the boundaries of that role, when he or she is driven towards manic enactments in order to vanquish the death drive, the negative dimension is no longer peripheral and will start to attack. No analyst, no analysand, no setting, no superego, no prohibitions, none of this exists anymore. Only unbound drives remain with their work of disorganization and destruction. This was the questioning of Angela in the beginning. In my view, this may explain, at least in part, why various kinds of transgression have occurred in times of war. Some analysts have had to deal with devastating drive impulses that have led them to sabotage the analytical setting. Being themselves, they are sexual abusers, aggressive abusers, transgressions by psychoanalysts. Being themselves, their only reference in the dereliction of their work in isolation, faced with wave after wave of negative aspects attacking them from all sides, they felt themselves to be like gods, allowing themselves all sorts of illicit maneuvers, like supreme beings, all powerful, deciding purely by themselves what they could do. Similarly, the war situation where impunity is the norm may well have fed into a pre-existing perverse way of operating in some analysts. They exploit the lawlessness that reigned at the time with no limit to its expansion and no repression to hold it in check. Laws no longer existed, so they became the law. War did not create morbidity, but it enabled it to be expressed. It gave expression to a pathological state already present. In the work of the negative, André Green writes, "The work of the negative will concern itself with the relation to the object caught in the crossfire of the destructive drives on the one hand and the life or love drives on the other. The work of the negative, thus, comes down to one question: how, faced with the destruction which threatens everything, can a way be found for desire to live and love?" I would tend to answer that question as follows. In times of war, through the interrelation between analyst and analysan, with the analyst remaining in the role of analyst. This is an object-related dimension of love and of life, as against the drive impulses of destructiveness and death. There remains for the analyst some real analytical work, processing the mental trauma, which its echoes in the trauma of the surrounding culture, because bombs that explode as metaphors for drive-related phenomena repeatedly wound and destroy. That is when the psychoanalytic setting can come to the fore. It can help to find some way of breaking free of that incessant repetition by reactualizing fragments of the trauma, the resurgence of drive-related phenomena that return and become part of the present. The analytical situation is then cathected as a solution, as a loop in the trauma through which it can be processed. When destructiveness is everywhere and we are faced with unpredictability, it's no longer a matter of holding on to the immuability of the setting. It is no longer a matter of developing a thick skin, as Freud said in his to dominate the countertransference, as Freud said in his letter to Jung when he told him about develop a thick skin to dominate the countertransference. It's no longer a matter of emotional coldness. Also, Freud said in his advice to the doctors. So it is no longer a matter of developing a thick skin in order to dominate countertransference. It is no longer a matter of emotional coldness. It is no longer a matter of interpreting and transforming. What is important is to be present as a psychoanalyst, and remain as one. Remain as one and create. Create while thinking clinically. Thank you.